Welcome back, folks, to part 3 of our notes on the cardiovascular system. During this section, we're going to mainly be looking at the structure of the heart and the functions of the different parts of the heart. Let's begin. So, the heart is approximately the size of your fist, okay, located superior to the diaphragm, slightly left of the midline, and anterior to the vertebral column, so right about here. Okay, if you were to drill a hole back through the middle of your sternum here, you would hit heart. So it's not all the way on the left side, but it is shifted slightly to the left, just behind your sternum. We can see that in this image here. You can see above the diaphragm, intermediate to the lungs. We can see here a front to back. There's the spinal column. There's the mediastinum where the esophagus and the major arteries and veins run, and the heart sits right behind the sternum, so it's not very deep here. Okay. The pericardium, we've mentioned this before. It's a serous membrane, kind of around the heart. It protects and lubricates it, double-walled sac around the heart. The outer part, okay, the parietal pericardium, is very tough and fibrous. The inner part, the visceral pericardium, is tight to the surface of the heart. Hard to even distinguish it and separate it when we get into dissections. And in between there, you'll have the fluid, the pericardial fluid, which acts as a lubricant because your heart's beating 70 beats a minute all day, every day, which means it's going to wear on other things. So just like any moving parts, you want to have them well lubricated. So, like I said before, the pericardium protects and anchors the heart. It's also what helps hold the heart in place. It prevents overfilling of the heart with blood. It's got that firm outer shell. You just can't pump more pressure in there because the pericardium is going to be pushing back in against the heart. And like I said before, it allows the heart to work in a relatively friction-free environment. Here we can see the different layers of it. We're just kind of taking a cross-section right through here of the heart. So here we have, so this is the heart muscle itself, and this is inside the heart. So inside the heart, lining the heart, we have the endocardium, meaning the inner heart, endo for inner, cardium for heart. Smooth, stratified, or not stratified, simple squamous cells for smooth blood flow. Then we've got the myocardium right here, myo for muscle, cardium for heart, so that's where the heart muscle is. Outside that, you have the visceral layer of the pericardium, pericardial cavity full of pericardial fluid, and then the parietal pericardium on the outside. Okay, so already kind of mentioned these, but we have the epicardium on the outer layer. Myocardium is the part that's got the heart muscle itself and does most of the contractions, or does all the contractions, but forms the bulk of the heart. The fibrous skeleton of the heart, lots of interlacing layers of connective tissue, which helps to reinforce the myocardium. So it's running through the muscle, kind of like rebar and concrete, so to speak, or if you got ripstop nylon, you know how you got those, it kind of looks like squares of thicker fibers, and then you got the thinner nylon in between. Well, that fiber skeleton is kind of like that ripstop stuff. Keeps it from ripping itself apart. And the endocardium, that inner endothelial lining that lines the chambers and continues on into the vessels. So you have a nice smooth surface. Now let's take a look at the major vessels of the heart, the front view, and we're going to take the anterior view, and we're going to take a look here at the heart. We'll start with the vessels returning blood to the heart. Now, if a vessel is returning blood towards the heart, it is a vein. If it's carrying blood away from the heart, it's an artery. Arteries away, veins to. Okay, that is a defining characteristic. Well, it's one of the defining characteristics because it's going away or to. There's some structural differences, which we'll get into later. All right, so vessels returning blood to the heart. We have the superior and inferior vena cavas right here, superior and inferior. Superior because it's above, inferior below. The superior is draining the arms, the shoulders, and the head and upper chest back into the heart. The inferior vena cava is bringing in blood from the lower torso and legs back into the heart. And then we have the right and left pulmonary veins. Okay, so pulmonary means we have to do with the lungs, right? Pulmonary. So these are bringing blood from the lungs to the heart. Now, if they're bringing blood from the lungs to the heart, are they oxygenated or deoxygenated? Oxygenated, right? That's why they went to the lungs in the first place. So these are actually these little red ones. 2 on this side, 2 on that side. They are bringing oxygenated blood back to the heart. So there's a common misconception that all veins carry deoxygenated blood. That is not true. Veins in the systemic system, the ones that are going from the heart to your body and then back to the heart, those would be systemic. Those veins are carrying deoxygenated blood, okay, because they're coming back to the heart so they can go sent to the lungs to pick up more oxygen. The pulmonary circulation, the ones taking blood from the heart to the lungs and back to the heart, those are kind of reversed. There, the veins are oxygenated. As you can see, we've got them red. And remember, red is not because the blood is red when it's oxygenated and blue when it's deoxygenated. It's simply a way for us to visually tell the difference in images. Okay. The major blood vessels carrying blood away from the heart. We got the pulmonary trunk, okay, right here, pulmonary, okay. So where do you think it's going? Yeah, to the lungs, and it's going to split into left and right pulmonary arteries going to the lungs. Remember, that's carrying blood away from the heart, so it's an artery. And then we have the ascending aorta right here, this big honking thing coming out. Okay, that is then going to branch into 3 branches up here, and then turn and go down around behind the heart, okay, to the rest of the body. This is the one that's carrying all the blood out of the heart to the rest of the body. So we also have arteries and veins that supply and drain the heart muscle itself with blood. Now, the heart muscle itself, you're saying, well, can it just absorb everything it needs from the blood moving through the inside? Not really. It's moving through the inside too quickly, and it's not nearly enough surface area to get blood to all of the different muscle that the heart needs to get it to. We need that thick network of capillary beds in order to get the blood into the capillaries so that we can increase surface area, so we can increase the amount of diffusion going on. We need to have arteries and veins supplying those capillary beds. So arteries, got them right here. You can see them a little bit right here. Red ones leaving the heart, okay, and going to feeding the muscle with blood, the coronary arteries. And then we've got the veins, which are bringing blood from the heart back into the circulatory system so that we can repump it all around. These are the ones that we tend to have a lot of problems with bypass surgeries and stents and stuff like that when people have heart problems. It's often having to do with clots in these coronary arteries or veins. So here we can see this picture. You can see here we've got the superior and inferior vena cavas, pulmonary trunk here leaving the right side of the heart. We've got the aorta coming up and over the top. We've got the pulmonary veins bringing blood back to the heart from the lungs. Taking a look at it from the other side, okay, we can see here's the aorta. Here are the pulmonary arteries. Here's the superior vena cava. Here are the pulmonary veins. And here's where the inferior vena cava comes in on the back side of the heart. And then, of course, you can see a good look at some of the coronary arteries and veins here as well. Let's open it up and take a look where these major arteries and veins enter and leave the heart. So on this side over here, on the right side of this heart, which as you were looking at, it looks to be the left, because we remember, whenever we're doing a dissection or talking about organisms, we're talking about them in the anatomical position. We assume that, and we're always looking from their perspective. So this is my right, even though it may show up on the left of your screen. This is my right hand, this is my left hand. So this is the right side of my heart, this is the left side of my heart. This is still the right side of my heart, this is still the left side of my heart, okay? So here you can see that we have the right atrium, and that is what is collecting the blood from the vena cavas, the superior and inferior vena cavas. So it's collecting that deoxygenated blood from the body. That right atrium then collects that blood, pushes it down into the left ventricle here, a much beefier, you can see much thicker muscle here, because it's got to pump the blood a little bit further. The atrium just had to pump it down into the ventricle. This right ventricle is then connected, you can see, to the left, into the pulmonary artery, which are going to go to the lungs to pick up oxygen. So it's stronger to pump that blood up to the lungs, and it comes back from the lungs through the pulmonary veins right there into the left atria up on top. Okay. Left atria will then pump it down into the left ventricle. Look at the thickness of the muscle in the left ventricle, guys. Why do you think it's so much thicker than the right ventricle or either of the aortas? Yeah, because this chamber is pumping the blood out to the whole body, all the way up to the tip of the head, ends of the fingers, bottom of your toes, and helping to get it back up to the heart a little bit too. So that is very thick muscle. A lot of times, if you're not sure what's the right or left side of a heart, if you're feeling it or dissecting it, you can just feel by the thickness of the muscle. The side that's got thicker muscle is the left. thinner muscle is the right. But that left ventricle, guys, is then going to pump that out through the aorta and send that oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. All right, gave a little overview of this looking at the pictures, but the atria, the two upper chambers, and you'll see me pointing at my chest and belly a lot when I'm doing this. I kind of envision my whole torso as a big heart. I should get a t-shirt made up with this. But this would be the two atria up here where my pecs are. And then the much stronger, bigger ventricles are my stomach because it's stronger and bigger. But this is my right atria, right ventricle, left ventricle. So the atria up here are the receiving chambers of the heart. And like I said, blood is going to enter into the right atria here from the superior and inferior vena cavas, okay, into this area. Okay, and this atria is going to get its blood from the pulmonary veins coming from the lungs back to the heart. So this stuff is oxygenated, and here we got deoxygenated on the right side. The ventricles down below, they also have a bit of a V shape, right? These are the pumping chambers or the sending it out chambers. That's why they've got more muscle. Okay, the right ventricle is going to pump it into the pulmonary trunk and thus to the lungs. So it doesn't have very far to go, just out to the lungs and then back. So you notice the muscle is much thinner here, whereas the left ventricle is going to pump oxygenated blood out to the entire body, which is why it's got much thicker muscle. So here we can follow the pathway of blood through the heart and lungs. Okay, let's start at the right atrium. Through the tricuspid valve right here, it's a one-way valve to make sure blood doesn't go backwards. Okay, into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, okay, I guess there's not here, it's going to be up here, through the pulmonary semilunar valve. It's not really visible, okay, through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. From the lungs, it's going to come back in through the pulmonary veins, here and here, into the left atrium. From the left atrium, it's going to go through the bicuspid valve, into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, out through the aortic semilunar valves to the aorta. From the aorta to arteries, arterioles, capillaries, back through venules, veins, and then back to the heart. And that part down there is all called the systemic circulation. From the left ventricle back to the right atria, that is the systemic circuit. From the right ventricle through the lungs and then back to the left ventricle or atria is the pulmonary circuit.
The normal heart has two sides, a right side and a left side, and four chambers, the top receiving chambers, or atrium, and the lower chambers, which are thick-walled pumping chambers, called ventricles. Red blood cell will come from either the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava and enter into the right atrium. The blood then flows across the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. The right ventricle then squeezes and ejects that blood cell into a vessel called the pulmonary artery. Pulmonary artery splits into two vessels, each going to the lungs. As that red blood cell makes its way through the lung, it returns through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium. That blood is now oxygenated. It's picked up oxygen, then goes across the mitral valve into the left ventricle, which does most of the work in terms of delivery of blood flow to the body. That blood cell is now ejected into the aorta to some organ or muscle or skin in the human body.
So here we can see it on this picture. We got pulmonary circuit up above, from the heart to the lungs and back to the heart, and systemic from the heart down to the body and back. So let's follow it again. So let's go from, let's just start here, same spot. So we got the right atria, right ventricle, pulmonary arteries, deoxygenated blood up to the capillaries in the lungs where it can drop off carbon dioxide, pick up oxygen. So it's reoxygenated back through arteries, veins, through the pulmonary veins, back into the left atrium, down into the left ventricle, out through the aorta, through arteries, and then arterioles, smaller arteries, into capillaries where we drop off the oxygen at the tissues where it's needed and pick up the carbon dioxide. So now we got deoxygenated blood coming back through capillaries, venules, veins, into the vena cava. This picture is a little misleading. It looks like it's one thing, it's split into two. It's not. It's just trying to simplify it. Superior comes from the head area, inferior comes from the lower body, back into the right atria, and we start all over again. Okay, so the coronary circulation is the functional blood supply to the heart muscle itself. The heart is pumping 70 beats a minute on average your entire life. When it stops doing that, so does your life. Okay, so it needs to be bomber circulation. So it does have collateral routes, meaning multiple ways for blood to get to the same part of the heart. Okay, so even if one vessel is occluded or blocked slightly, we got a back door to try to get some blood back around to that side. It's kind of our backup system. Is it as good as if the main system's working? No, but it does get you some more life. All right, here we can see the arterial supply coming out. You can see it's coming out of the base of the aorta, traveling here, and you can see how it's bright red on the front side of the heart. On the back side of the heart, we can see it's light, and you can see how these vessels kind of run together in a few spots. So let's say there was a blockage here, so blood wasn't getting down into this part of the heart. It could conceivably come around this way, through here, down here, up and around, and get to that spot. Not nearly as efficiently. Your heart wouldn't be able to beat as well, but it might be enough to keep you going. We have the same thing here with venous supply. This collateral route right here, and you can see where it's coming in right here. So we mentioned heart valves before, and they are simply unidirectional valves that make sure the blood flows in only one direction through the heart. Okay, you can think of them like a tube of toothpaste, right? If it's only got one way it can exit the tube, when you squeeze it, it all comes out the end you want, right? But if your little brother or sister played a prank on you and cut off the backside of the tube of toothpaste, when you squeeze it in the middle, it squirts out both ends, and you waste a lot of that toothpaste, right? It doesn't get where you want it to go. Same thing happens in the heart if the valves aren't working properly. Okay, so the valves, let's say this one is right here. Let's say this is the valve, I'll turn it this way, going from my right atria down into my right ventricle. Blood, let's say the valve's sitting like this normally, right? The blood, when the atria contracts, can push this down, and blood can go into my right ventricle. When the ventricle contracts and pushes up, it pushes this valve shut, and it can't go back up. So the valve can get opened up, but just because of its physical structure, it can only go one direction. Okay, it's kind of like the teeth on a snake or the tongue hairs on your cat. If you haven't done this yet, when you're dissecting your cat, guys, if you run your finger along the tongue and push down, you can push back down the tongue, and it slides over the tongue real nice. But there's these little hairs sticking up from the tongue, kind of pointing in this direction, so you can go back and they lay down. But when something wants to come out, it catches on those backwards facing hairs. And that's to keep little live prey from wiggling out of the cat's mouth. They can wiggle in, but they can't wiggle out. We see that with snake teeth and stuff too. They got the same backward facing direction, so things can wiggle in, but they can't wiggle out. Okay. AV valves, or atrioventricular valves, as the name implies, are between the atria and the ventricles. They each have different names, but I'm only going to test you on the fact that they're AV valves now. They're between the atria and the ventricles, and make sure that the blood can go from the atria down into the ventricles, but not from the ventricles back up into the atria. Okay, and we have chordae tendineae in there. So here's an AV valve, right? And these little cords attached to these little bumps of muscle called papillary muscles, these are here to keep your valves from turning inside out. So blood can push through here, no problem. There's nothing holding these valves from going down. But when this squeezes, it's pushing back up here with a lot of pressure. There's a lot of muscle here, a lot of pressure pushing back up on that valve, and it could conceivably blow the valve backwards. Think of it like an umbrella in a big windstorm, right? You know, you're walking along, all of a sudden a big windstorm comes along, and it can turn your umbrella inside out. Now, if you tied strings to the end of all the umbrella ribs and then tied them down to the handle down here, so they went from the ribs down to the handle and you held on here, it'd be a lot harder to turn that umbrella inside out. That's kind of what these things are. There's like those little strings tied down to the handle of your umbrella. Keep it from turning inside out. Okay, the semilunar valves. These are the ones, I've only got one good image here, right here in this aorta. I'll put another picture up there, but they look like little cups, hence why they're called like tricuspid valves. Okay, and their job, they're not having to resist as much force, right? Because you got your ventricle, say your left ventricle here is squeezing, pushes the blood up through the aorta, so they're kind of shaped like this. Let's say this is my next aorta and this is my ventricle. The blood can go up, it can push these open, and then when the ventricle stops contracting and relaxes, the pressure down here relaxes, and the blood that was in the aorta wants to rush back in, right? He wants to backflow a little bit. So these things act like cups. They're like little cups. When the blood pushes down, it fills up the cup, and they push against each other, and they're like these little cups that keep everything from backflowing. So you have those where the blood leaves the ventricles in here. You also have some valves in veins. Veins are a relatively low pressure vessel, bringing blood back to the heart. They don't have that force of the beat behind them to keep them pushing forward. So there's valves in there as well to make sure that the blood doesn't backflow in the veins. Okay, and here we can see some of them. Over here, we've got the images of them. And here's real images on an actual heart. So you can see those valves. Here's the papillary muscle and the chordae tendineae inside a heart. Here you can see the heart. You can see how, can you tell me which, is this the left or the right side of the heart over here? Yeah, it's the left side, right? Look how much thicker the muscle is over here. So this side is pumping to the body. This side with thinner muscle is just pumping to the lungs. And we can see the valves there pretty well. And we can see kind of this function that I was talking about before. Here is the atria pushing the valves open as the blood comes down. But when the ventricle contracts, it pushes the blood back up, and these valves get shut just by the force of the blood going up. And we can see the papillary muscles and chordae tendineae doing their job down here. And we can see the same thing here. Here's semilunar valves. Blood goes up. They open up, no problem. Blood wants to come back down. The cups fill up and close it off. And we'll do this video here just to kind of show you it.
The heart is a pump which must circulate blood through two different but interconnected vascular systems. The smaller of these systems is the pulmonary system. Blood returning from the upper part of the body is delivered to the right atrium of the heart by the superior vena cava, one of the body's two largest veins, while blood returning from the lower part of the body is delivered to the right atrium by the other major vein, the inferior vena cava. Contraction of the right atrium in each cardiac cycle forces blood into the right ventricle. This is followed by contraction of the right ventricle, which pumps blood into the pulmonary artery, sending it on through the blood vessels of the lungs. As the right ventricle contracts and pressure within the right ventricle rises, the tricuspid valve situated at the opening between the right atrium and right ventricle shuts, preventing any backflow. The pressure generated by contraction of the right ventricle soon opens the pulmonary valve and blood enters the circulation of the lungs. After passing through the circulation of the lungs, the blood, having been recharged with oxygen and having rid itself of carbon dioxide, is returned through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium. The left atrium, too, contracts, forwarding blood into the left ventricle in order to fill it before it contracts. As the powerful left ventricle contracts, the mitral valve shuts, preventing backflow into the left atrium. The aortic valve opens, and blood is forced into the aorta, which distributes it to the rest of the body apart from the lungs. As the contraction comes to an end and pressure in the aorta falls, the aortic valve snaps shut to prevent backflow into the left ventricle.
And that ends part 3 on the basic structures of the heart and the basic functions of those structures. Join me next time when we cover part 4 of the cardiac cycle and output. See you next time.